Good evening. So it's my great pleasure and honour to formally introduce Professor Deborah Lipstadt to you this evening. She's Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University and has received Honorary Doctorates from 6 different universities. And I could take up far too much time and dazzle you with her many achievements and accolades, but I know you would rather hear her than hear about her. That said, the following highlights should give you an indication of what you're in store for tonight. So among Professor Lipstadt's many accomplishments are these. She was appointed by President Bill Clinton to the US Holocaust Memorial Council, and she served as a consultant to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and to the US Congress on Holocaust denial. She advised the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, on matters of religious persecution abroad. President George W. Bush invited her to represent the White House at the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 2005. And on the 50th anniversary of the Eichmann trial in 2011, she addressed the State Department on its impact. She is the author of many books, which are on sale here tonight, and she will indeed sign them for you, including the highly acclaimed Eichmann trial and History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier, in which she describes the trial that she undertook against the Holocaust denier David Irving. The work won, among many distinctions, the prestigious National Jewish Book Award, and Participant Pictures and BBC Films are currently making the story into a movie. Her contributions to the Jewish and broader community were perhaps most aptly recognised when she received the Jewish Council for Public Affairs' highest honour, the Albert D. Chernin Award, given to an American Jew whose work best exemplifies the social justice imperatives of Judaism, Jewish history, and the protection of the Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment. So as evidenced in this very brief overview of her many accomplishments, Professor Lipstadt is indeed that very rare combination, a historian who has not only written history, but who has also made history. I know you will be challenged and inspired by her address tonight. She will speak to us on the implications of the new anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and anti-Israelism. Please welcome Professor Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. I've come to Australia many times, and I'm always pleased because I am reminded some of us in the United States live, particularly in the Jewish community, live a provincial existence and forget the vibrancy of Jewish communities in other parts of the world, particularly here, as we like to say, and you say it as well, down under. So I thank you. I'm also particularly pleased to be here for Shalom Institute because of the great work it's done and does and the impact it's had on the Australian Jewish community. Tonight, I would like to talk to you in a really serious and almost, not almost, but in an academic fashion about the connection between Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, and to argue that Holocaust denial is simply a form of, not solely, but a form of anti-Semitism. In addition, I'd like to connect that to a certain degree to some of the remarks made about and attitudes shown about Israel and what we would call anti-Israelism. But I begin with a cautionary remark. My observations, my comments tonight should not be presented or construed as a suggestion that Holocaust denial is a clear and present danger. It is a small but persistent movement. It is engaged in by disparate groups and individuals. The truth of the matter is, far more individuals worldwide study about the Holocaust, and I understand it's now going to be introduced in the curriculum of New South Wales, than engage in Holocaust denial. However, having said that, Holocaust denial does have potent implications for the future. This is particularly so because deniers have become exceptionally adept at use of the internet and social media. So therefore, my remarks tonight should be not heard as a cry of alarm, but rather for a call for caution, sustained, and serious attention. In other words, I'm not saying, oi Gewalt, the sky is falling, but I'm saying, oi Gewalt, the sky has the potential to fall, and we should be aware of that. Let me begin by laying out the basic premises of Holocaust denial, those engaged by or promulgated by David Irving, Robert Faurisson, and even soon-to-be Iran's former president, Ahmadinejad. Goodbye. First of all, there was no attempt by the Third Reich to wipe out the Jews of Europe. Some Jews may have suffered, and some even have died or been killed, but they were not singled out for mass annihilation. Those Jews who were persecuted were deserving of being persecuted. German Jews were engaged in such nefarious activities that Germany's hostility towards them was legitimate. Those Jews who were shot by the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front were guilty of being spies and partisans. The Jews who were incarcerated in concentration camps were placed there, and this is going to sound absurd, but I've heard it many times from deniers, even in the courtroom, were placed there by Germans for their own protection, to save them from the righteous anger and hostility of German Aryans. The number 6 million is exaggerated. It is something that has been devised and in the post-war by Jews in the post-war period. Gas chambers are a singular impossibility. And people who purport to be survivors of the concentration and death camps are sociopaths, liars, or doing this for financial gain. And finally, the Jews have devised all this in order to get a state and to displace another people from that state. Now, what is the best way of explaining the irrationality, if not the absurdity, of Holocaust deniers, particularly in, let's say, a classroom? One of the things one can do is follow the footnotes back to the sources. So when a denier says, I have a document that proves, or this document proves that the Jews didn't die, and this document proves that Hitler was the best friend the Jews had, something David Irving says, if you follow the footnotes back to that document, you find, not in most cases and not in the vast preponderance of cases, but in every single case, that the document doesn't prove that. That's exactly what we did, my lawyers did in my trial. We didn't prove what happened during the Holocaust, but we proved that what deniers say happened didn't happen. And it's a distinction, I think, with a difference. So you could follow those footnotes back, check their sources, look at their supposed proofs, and you will find that they prove nothing of what they are saying. As Cambridge historian Richard Evans, who was the lead historical witness on my team, my legal team, told the court, quote, not one of his books, speeches, or articles, not one paragraph, not one sentence in any of them can be taken on trust as an accurate representation of its historical subject. All of them are completely worthless as history, because David Irving cannot be trusted anywhere in any of them to give a reliable account of what he is talking about or writing about. And he goes on to say, in no way can David Irving be considered an historian. And by the way, though the case was my defense, David Irving sued me for libel, my defense against David Irving, but you can really replace the name David Irving with the word Holocaust deniers, because he has either created the arguments that they use, or he is the mouthpiece for arguments created by other deniers. He, of course, having had a reputation, independent of being a denier, had much more access to the media than any of the others. But there's another way to demonstrate the irrationality of Holocaust denier. One can, in fact, expose its basic fallacy of the basic fallacy of Holocaust denial without following the footnotes, without the arduous task of research. When I talk about the topic with my students, I say to them, in order for deniers to be correct in their contention that the Holocaust was a myth, who has to be wrong? So using a deductive approach, the students very quickly come up with a list of suspects. And they generally begin, and correctly so, with the victims. Those who say, this is my story, this is what happened to me. Those people who can speak in the first person singular. And I know you have many here in the Australian, the Sydney Jewish community, but their number is diminishing rapidly by the tyranny of the clock. Now, survivors will say, but there are inconsistencies in these stories that they tell. One will tell getting off a train and turning left and walking to where the doctors at Auschwitz stood, and some will talk about getting off a train and walking to the right. How can it be true? Now, there are two things, first of all. Some did get off the train. The doctors usually stood in the middle. Certainly, we're talking about the Hungarian deportations. So if you were one end of the train, you got off and you walked to the right. If you were at the other end, you walked to the left. So very often these seeming inconsistencies can easily be explained. But there's another way of looking at it. Salman Rushdie, in his memoir on his years in hiding because of Muslim threats on his life, recalled being told by a high-ranking British intelligence officer, quote, "When there is no variation in the story, then we are 100% certain it is a fake. Human beings telling the truth never told the story quite the same way twice." So when there are inconsistencies, this is how people tell stories, number one. Number two, the arrival of people who survived the death camps, but their arrival at those death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, and others, was designed to be chaotic and to make for inability to know exactly and to see exactly what was happening around you. So survivors would have to all be wrong for deniers to be right. But another argument made by deniers, of course, is that the Germans were so efficient and meticulous in their work that had they actually wanted to kill the Jews, they would have killed all the Jews. Or Germans were so good at what they did that the fact that there are any survivors, deniers argue, proves that there was never really a Holocaust. So when I mention this to my students, I say to them, disprove this. And sometimes it takes a few moments, but certainly, usually with remarkable alacrity, they will say, well, wait a minute. The Germans also wanted to win the war, and they didn't win the war. In other words, this idea that the Germans were so efficient and were able to do anything they wanted is simply not true. So here again, you can demolish the denier's argument. But to go back to the list of people who have to be wrong, so survivors. Who else has to be wrong? Bystanders. If any of you remember or have seen, and it's a commitment, you have to make a relationship to watch this movie. It's 9.5 hours. It's Claude Lanzmann's documentary Shoah, one of the epic documentaries, not epic documentaries on the Holocaust, but epic documentaries that has been produced. In it, he interviews residents of towns in Poland that were located around the camps. And they watched as the trains went into the camps day after day, filled with people, and came out empty. Went in filled with people, came out empty. They knew precisely what was going on there. For deniers to be right, not only survivors, but these bystanders have to be wrong. They, of course, were not the only bystanders. There were Polish Christians, such as Jan Karski, from Warsaw, who snuck into the camps and saw into Treblinka and saw what was happening, who snuck into the Warsaw Ghetto, and then with the help of the Polish underground made his way across Europe, came to London and to the United States, where he met with various officials, including President Roosevelt, trying to alert them to what was happening. And of course, as you know, as we all well know, very little happened in terms of a response from the Western world. But Karski wasn't the only one who tried to bring word of what was happening. There were Germans, such as the industrialist Edward Schulte, the head of a mining company, which had a branch near Auschwitz, and who had learned from SS officers what was taking place in the camp. He gave the information on the gassing to the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland, Gerhard Riegner. Another bystander was the renegade SS officer Kurt Gerstein, who witnessed a gassing in Belzec and then told the Swedish diplomat about it. These are just a few examples of word that came out, not from survivors, but from bystanders. But at this point, I usually urge my students to push further. Say, think of another group that yet must be wrong for deniers to be right. I tell them from a deductive or forensic perspective, this last group, in fact, may be the most significant. Not only have those in this category not denied the killing, but they have affirmed that they happened. In short, the perpetrators, the Germans themselves, are the best situated to challenge the deniers' claims. At no war crimes trial since World War II, and there have been many, there weren't enough, but there have been many, have defendants ever tried to defend themselves by arguing that the Holocaust did not happen. They have offered a variety of other justifications. I did not do it. I was following orders, I had no choice, if I hadn't done it I would be killed, etc., etc. Such was the case at Nuremberg, such was the case at the Eichmann trial in 1961, at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in 1963, and at every other World War II war crimes trial. Simply put, perpetrators, those who did the actual killing and those who gave the instructions to kill, have never suggested it didn't happen. Yet deniers who were not there do so. Deniers ever resilient have an explanation, of course, for the perpetrators, particularly Germany's failure to deny the Holocaust. So what deniers will say, what David Irving says, is they contend that these defendants were being tried by their former enemies, who made it quite clear that had the defendants refused to admit to these crimes, they would have been punished severely. So what deniers say is that these war criminals who were on trial were told, if you don't admit to doing this, even though you didn't do it, you're going to be punished severely. But such a contention ignores a basic question. What could the defendants gain by falsely admitting to participating in a horrendous crime? In other words, by saying, I did this, they then opened themselves up to tremendous punishment, which many of them did not, again, not enough, but many of them did get. But confessing only guaranteed that they would get a more severe punishment than would otherwise be the case. But it wasn't only individuals who admitted to this wrongdoing. Germany, particularly the Federal Republic, West Germany, not only admitted that this crime had been committed by its predecessors, but accepted responsibility for its impact in the form of reparations. Why would a nation admit to such a crime, particularly one that was destined to force it to wear an unparalleled historical badge of shame, if it were not true? What deniers will say is that this was the only way Germany could be admitted back into the quote-unquote family of civilized nations. And had it not acknowledged it, it would have gained an even greater degree of a pariah status. Again, it's a weak argument because Germany has had to bear that burden for many decades and will have to continue in the future. I also point out to my students that we have a myriad of documents which prove, the gas chambers prove the events, various events of the Holocaust. And what deniers will say, of course, is that these documents were all forged. Well, I make the students think about it. you forge a document, you can't just say, oh, I have this document here. If you know anything about German wartime documents, they have file numbers, they have record numbers, they have sequence numbers. There's a whole system of numberings, whole system of filing. And many governments did this, but the Germans, to paraphrase the book of Proverbs, and I apologize for this connection, surpassed them all in this way of documenting. So if you're going to forge a document and plant it in an archive, you've got to somehow work out that classification that suddenly you're planting a new document there. It's not only that you have to work out the classification system, but the forged document would have to be in the same typeface, in the same fonts, and would have to have the same strength typewriter ribbon as the documents which preceded it and the documents which followed it. And I point out most of my students don't know what a typewriter ribbon is, but they know what a font is. But I think some of us here are old enough to remember those typewriter ribbons, you know, the red and the black. And copies of that document would have to be in other archives. You know, if you sent it out, you have a copy in your original archive, and then the recipient. It is a massive and virtually impossible job to plant a document such as this. So to answer deniers, you can do the arduous work, as we did in our legal team, of following the footnotes, or you can just think logically and show the illogic of such an argument. But I want to move from the essence of Holocaust denial to talk for a moment about Holocaust denial as a form of anti-Semitism. In fact, the explanation, quote unquote, that deniers give as to why Germany accepted responsibility for this massive crime, would never committed it, deftly draws on enduring anti-Semitic stereotypes. What do I mean by that? Deniers claim, as I said earlier, that Jews created this hoax in order to win the world's sympathy, which they then used to secure reparations from Germany and establish the State of Israel. And for a moment here, let me just digress and note as an aside that many of us, you don't have to be a denier to think this way, many of us link the Holocaust with the establishment of the State of Israel. Many of us often say, well, the State of Israel was established because of the Holocaust. There's serious historical reason to question that supposition. First of all, well before World War II and the annihilation of the Jews, the British Peel Commission, 1936, proposed the creation of a Jewish political entity, a decision rejected by the Arabs. Moreover, the very people who were murdered, not all of them, but many of them, would have been immigrants to this new state. There were enough people in the Yishuv, even before the war began, that there would have been some form of a political entity. Moreover, it took over 3 years after the end of the Holocaust for the state to be established, and one could legitimately argue that it really came about because the British just were overwhelmed by the military and political complexities in Palestine and just said, we're out of here, and the state came about because of it. So this reflexive kind of argument that the only reason there's a State of Israel is because of the Holocaust is really, I think, a poor argument on historical grounds. Moreover, it placed a tremendous burden on this new state in having to absorb refugees who came with no funds, no family, no background, and in many cases terribly and legitimately so traumatized by what they had experienced. However, let me return to my assertion that at the heart of Holocaust denial lies anti-Semitism. So what are deniers saying? Deniers are saying Jews made up this story, and by so doing victimized Germany, stole funds from Germany, and victimized an innocent people in the Middle East and had them kicked out of their lands. In other words, Jews are not victims, but they are victimizers. They compelled Germany to pay billions in reparations, and it still does, forced the world to grant them a state, and displaced another people. So the scenario that Jews created this vast myth in order to get a state and to enrich themselves, at the heart of it lies traditional anti-Semitic imagery. What's the traditional anti-Semitic argument? You know, there are always stereotypes engaged with prejudice. Whatever particular group you're engaging in prejudice against, there are stereotypes. In my country, the stereotype very often associated with African American stereotype, not true, stereotype, was shiftless. The code words were shiftless and lazy. If you were talking about Italians, you might talk about mafioso. If you were talking about homosexuals, you might talk about weak wristed, effeminate. You had all sorts of stereotypes, which, of course, when you look at the reality, proved to be entirely untrue. And the stereotype, of course, associated with Jews, which goes back centuries. And the stereotype associated with anti-Semitism, not, of course, just in the United States, but worldwide, is, of course, the Jew as a manipulator, the small group of Jews who will manipulate the powers that be to work on their own behalf at the cost of the larger society. This stereotype, of course, has its roots in the deicide story, the crucifixion of Jesus, as portrayed in the New Testament. That event became the template for millennia of anti-Semitic charges, which incorporated elements of the deicide story. A small number of Jews harm a large number of Christians or any other ethnic group for the purpose of their own material or financial gain. So that, of course, in the deicide story, everybody is Jewish. This is irrelevant to the anti-Semites. Everybody is Jewish except the Romans who actually did the crucifixion, but don't confuse me with the facts, you know. I've made up my mind. So you take this template of Jews conniving, using their financial power to impose their will on many others, to make others suffer. That's the template for anti-Semitism. And you can take virtually any case of anti-Semitism, whether you're talking about poisoning of the wells, whether you're talking about blood libel, the making of matzah supposedly with the blood of Christian children, or the Jewish lobby, or whatever it might be. If you look at that, if you take apart that template, you will find those elements. And therefore, for the anti-Semite, Holocaust denial makes sense. If you're anti-Semitic and someone tells you, you know, this is the Jews made up this story in order to get money and get a land and use it's those small in number, use their political clout, to the anti-Semite, it makes sense. So when you think of Holocaust denial, recognize that you are thinking of something that is anti-Semitic. By the way, it's often very racist. White supremacists love Holocaust denial, because what they will argue is they will say the myth, quote unquote, of the Holocaust is used to keep them from arguing of the natural superiority of white people. They said, so the myth of the Holocaust keeps us from showing that white people are naturally superior. If you go to any white supremacist website, you will find this there. Now, what are the tactics of deniers? One of the tactics is something that changed. I had a chance speaking with members of other communities this morning at a meeting sponsored by the Board of Deputies, representatives of the Armenian community, the Syrian community, Cambodian community, Aboriginal, your native community here. And I pointed out to them that initially Holocaust deniers were presented themselves as neo-Nazis, open adulation of Adolf Hitler, open adulation of the Third Reich, often showing up in uniforms which were reminiscent, evocative of SS uniforms. But that changed in the 70s, and I think it's a change in tactics that you find in denial used with other genocides. In order to attract a more sophisticated and educated audience and to attract them to denial, what deniers began to do beginning in the 70s was present themselves as academics or individuals solely interested in correcting mistakes in history. We are not lovers of Nazism. We are not followers of Adolf Hitler. We just want to revise revisionism. That's why I don't use the word revisionism. I use the word denial. But they said, we just want to revise mistakes in history. Of course, the only supposed mistakes they looked at was the Holocaust. And they began to publish a journal that looked like an academic journal. It looked so much like an academic journal that a senior at Yale who had written his honors thesis on the Luftwaffe, and his professor said, you know, this is really good. You should try to get it published. He took himself off to the Yale library, looked at various historical journals to which he thought he might submit his thesis, found the Journal of Historical Review, the Denier's journal, said, oh, this looks like an interesting historical journal, sent his paper to them. They, of course, were thrilled to get a paper, even not from a Yale professor, but even from a Yale student, and they wrote him back immediately that they were going to publish it within a few months, and they sent him a check for a couple of $100s. When he turned to me and told me what had happened, I said, your tip-off should have been that they were going to publish it quickly and that they were going to pay you. Neither of those ever happened in the academic world. But my point is that, you know, the journal was so slick that it fooled him. If it fooled him, how many other people did it fool? They had conferences which sounded like academic conferences. And even people who knew they were Holocaust deniers would engage in this yes, but, which is a very dangerous kind of response. Yes, I know they're deniers, and yes, I know they're not correct, but maybe there's a little something to what they're saying. Maybe it wasn't 6 million. Maybe the gas chambers were impossible. Maybe the Jews were really bad so that they deserved what was done to them. This yet but, this rationalization is, of course, a very dangerous response. That's hardcore denial. Let me talk about a different form of denial as in the latter part of this talk, and that's what I call softcore denial. And usually you relate hardcore and softcore to something else, namely pornography, and I don't choose those categorizations in an uninformed manner, because I think that Holocaust denial is at its heart pornographic. In contrast to hardcore denial, no gas chambers, no 6 million, the things I laid out at the beginning, softcore deniers are those people who do not deny the facts of the Holocaust, but who raise questions about it in a more covert fashion. They make false comparisons with the Holocaust and generally do so for political ends. I would use a term to describe softcore denial, a very solid academic term, and say it's squishier than hardcore denial. It's sometimes harder to put your hand on exactly what's happening. But because of that, it's often more insidious. I am reminded of what a United States Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, said when he was deciding a case on pornography. And he said, I can't define it. I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And that's often the case with softcore denial. Often includes parallels between Holocaust and other tragedies in a way that diminishes the former and aggrandizes the latter. I'm not arguing you can't make comparisons. You have to make comparisons between genocides. That's how historians work. But often they're false comparisons. And here let me talk to the issue of Israel. For instance, the Holocaust and the Palestinian Nakba, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, have permeated comments about Israel and the Palestinians. Now, one can totally disagree with Israel's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. One could argue that much of the problems in the Middle East are Israel's fault. I don't believe that, but one could believe that. However, to speak of a genocide of the Palestinians, as critics of Israel often do, is to misconstrue the reality of the political situation. There is no genocide going on. There may be, some may see oppression, some may see discrimination, but to speak of a genocide is to create a situation which is completely untrue. In the same way, to talk about the Nazi-like tactics of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Force, is to deny the reality of what's taking place. One can argue, and there are many who do so, and I think including amongst them Israelis, who say that Israel, the IDF, has often done things which make them squirm, which make them very uncomfortable, which they feel are wrong. But again, to make the comparison between that and the Nazi-like tactics, or to say those are SS-like tactics, is to deny both the reality of what's going on in the Middle East and what the Nazis did. The distinction between criticism of Israel, justified or even or unjustified, and anti-Semitism, which is a very different thing, are they two different things? I'm not in any manner, shape, or form suggesting that criticism of Israel is ipso facto anti-Semitism. If you want to read criticism of Israel, read it in the only free press in the Middle East, and that's in the Israeli Free Press, and you can see serious criticism there. But I think that sometimes what happens is people fail to see the anti-Semitism in some of these attacks on Israel. And I think the line is crossed when Israel's right to exist as a sovereign Jewish state is challenged. When the very validity of the basic Zionist premise that Jews have the same right as any other nation to a homeland of their own, when that is denied, one is veering into anti-Semitism. The current and soon-to-be former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sachs, spoke of the hatred of the state of Israel as a Jewish collective, rather than the hatred of individual Jews, is the anti-Semitism of the 21st century. The irony is that Israel has become the object, and Israel, which Zionist dreamers and Zionist thinkers and ideologues thought would solve the problem of anti-Semitism, has now become in loco, in place of anti-Semitism. It's if those who people say, oh, I'm not an anti-Semite, I just don't believe in the existence of the state of Israel. I'm not an anti-Semitite, I'm just against the genocide of the Palestinians. Israel becomes, instead of the answer to anti-Semitism, becomes the foil for the anti-Semite. There are other ways in which the Holocaust is misused, whether it's by people for the ethical treatment of animals, and I'm not against the ethical treatment of animals in any manner, shape, or form. I have a dog. I love dogs. I don't like cats so much, so I have now lost half the audience, right? But who talk about a Holocaust on your plate, or as Vic was pointing out to me earlier today, you think 6 million people being murdered by the Nazis is bad. I'll tell you about 6 billion chickens, being, or whatever. There may be problems with ethical treatment of animals, but the comparisons to the Holocaust, I think, are discomforting at the very least. Or those who oppose abortion, talking about a genocide of little babies. Or Muslim leaders in Canada who recently compared government efforts to ban veils at citizenship hearings to laws against Jews in Nazi Germany. Sadly, there have even been Jewish groups that have made these false comparisons. In 2011, a group of Haredim pinned on yellow stars, put their children in striped uniforms, and paraded in the streets of Yerushalayim, protesting the government's attempt to stop gender separation on public transportation. They may believe that they have been discriminated against, but they're analogizing their claim with the Holocaust is so beyond the pale of what is acceptable that even it brought down a storm of criticism, and even some Haredim were critical of them. And then, of course, there are Jews at the other end of the cultural and religious spectrum who have engaged in the same kind of what I would call at the very best trivialization. A number of years ago, the Jewish Museum in New York, which could arguably be called one of the premier Jewish cultural institutions in the world, no slight to local museums, but it is a unique place, it mounted a show called Mirroring Evil. And the exhibit included a concentration camp made out of Legos and the picture of a well-fed man holding a Diet Coke while surrounded by concentration camp victims. While these are not denial per se at all, they can lead to a diminution of the seriousness of the Holocaust. There are other examples that I want to offer very quickly. We see what's happening in the former Soviet bloc countries, where communism and Nazism are being equated one with the other. This is not a defense of communism. I never liked communism. I visited Jews in the Soviet Union a number of times, and I saw its terrible impact, and you didn't have to go there to see it. But what is happening is that national groups, who in fact were allies with the Germans, are now being raised in status as heroes because they fought the communists. And Jews who joined resistance groups, which were often often sponsored by the Soviet Union, are being seen, Jews who are escaping the Nazis are seen as having been traitors to the cause. It's a political problem, but it's a political problem that was brought to the EU the EU was asked to equate communism and Nazism, and to say that both of these were terrible blots and of equal severity. So we see a wide range of ways in which you can have outright hardcore Holocaust denial, and then you can have this what I call softcore, squishier, but equally, if not more insidious version. Deniers will persist in their battle. I don't doubt that in the coming years, and as the time since the Holocaust grows longer, and as the number of eyewitnesses, and of course we wish them to 120 years, but as their number grows smaller and smaller, deniers will persist. We've never solved the problem of anti-Semitism. We've never solved the problem of racism. It is something that exists and something that will persist. But I think that it's exceptionally important for us to be aware of it, but to return in conclusion to my original point, not to say, oy vey, the sky is falling, but to encourage us even more to engage in study of and commemoration of the Holocaust. But again, let me add one last caveat there. Never should we say that study of the Holocaust, commemoration of the Holocaust, the magnificent Holocaust Museum like you have here in Sydney, introduction of the Holocaust into the educational curriculum, as will be the case here very shortly, is because of Holocaust denial. It would be important to have that museum. It would be important to have courses at the universities on the Holocaust. It would be important to have it in the curriculum, even if we had never heard of Holocaust denial. It is important in and of itself. The challenge facing us is how to fight the deniers without giving them gravitas, without adding to their sense of importance. They really are nothing but liars and anti-Semites. They must be fought, but we must never give them the credit of that's why we study the Holocaust. We must never give them the credit of saying, because of deniers, we write about the Holocaust, we research the Holocaust, we teach our children, we teach other groups about the Holocaust. The importance of this event stands on its own, even as we are aware and fight the efforts of Holocaust deniers to deny history, to lie about the facts, and to engage in what is nothing but anti-Semitism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, I just want to offer a formal vote of thanks to you, Professor Lipstadt, for an outstanding address. And then I want to explain to everyone how the next 20 minutes or so of the event is going to proceed. I have the honour and the privilege of asking the first few questions to Professor Lipstadt. And after that, I will open the floor to questions. So unlike Tony Jones, no comments will be taken. I will take nothing as a comment. I will only take questions because time is brief and we want to get the most out of Professor Lipstadt this evening that we can, even though we've already worked her hard. So I want to actually stay with the force of what you were saying in the final sections of your speech, and I want to talk about the educative force of learning about the Holocaust and teaching about the Holocaust. And in doing so, I want to take us to your recent publication on the Eichmann trial. And when you think about that trial, you were one of the people that wrote and advised on the 50th anniversary. What do you see as the major impact of that trial and the faults of that trial as well?
I think the major impact of the Eichmann trial, it's first necessary to say one or two words about the Nuremberg trials. At the Nuremberg trials, there were virtually no witnesses. I think the prosecution called 31 witnesses, the defense called more, but there were virtually no witnesses who had been victims of the final solution, no witnesses who had been victims of Nazi war crimes. In fact, the prosecution avoided calling Jews as Jewish survivors as witnesses because they felt they would be seen as biased against Germans. I can't imagine why they thought this, but in any case, when Gideon Hausner planned the Eichmann trial, he said he was going to rely on documents and the first person singular, the voice of the survivor. And he called approximately 100 survivors to give testimony. Much of the testimony they gave had nothing to do with what Eichmann did, and that was a criticism of one of the criticisms of the trial. But for the first time, the world listened to these survivors as they told the story of the final solution from the beginning through to its final days. Now, I don't want to suggest, and sometimes people say that before the Eichmann trial, survivors never spoke. It's not true. Many had spoken, and many of those who testified had spoken and had given testimony. The difference was, and this goes to the heart of the matter, that until the Eichmann trial, people didn't listen to the survivors. And that's what changed, that they saw these people, the Israeli young people saw that these were not quote-unquote ghetto Jews, diaspora Jews, weak, that for some reason this happened to them, but they realized that there but for fortune go you or I, and the world began to listen in a way that it had never listened before. I think that's one of the major impacts of the Eichmann trial, and it's not just the impact is not just in terms of the Holocaust, but in terms of all genocides. In a recent case at the ICC, the International Criminal Court at The Hague, the judges spoke about a witness of a survivor of the events in the former Yugoslavia, and they talked about the right of the witness to be heard, something which didn't exist at Nuremberg. That changes with the Eichmann trial.
Great, thank you, thank you. I want to stay with the idea of how survivors in particular have contributed to Holocaust education. And as you are no doubt aware, Australia took the largest survivor population per capita after Israel. And certainly in the Australian context, those survivors were fundamental in setting up the Holocaust education institutions that we have, the Sydney Jewish Museum, the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne. Now, we are, as you said, witnessing the passing of the survivors. We will no longer have access to the direct voices. Given that, how do we, in a sense, how do we move forward? What are some of the directions you see for Holocaust education? You know,
I've been teaching about the Holocaust probably for, for over 30 years. I know it's over 30 years. I know that I can give the most intense, intellectually scintillating course and prepare my lectures and make sure that each lecture is well argued and well presented and keeps the attention of the students sitting before me. But I also know that the session in which I bring in a Holocaust survivor, the students listen in a different kind of fashion. Particularly the many students now, when I first began teaching, students would talk about, would be children of survivors, now they're grandchildren of survivors, but many of the students are non-Jews, have never met a survivor, never heard from a survivor. For them, seeing a survivor of this genocide is the most overwhelming experience. And we won't have that voice of the first person singular. It will be different. But that's the case with all of history. So I want to make 2 points that I think to sort of calm us at this terrible fear, and it's a legitimate fear of the loss of the privilege of hearing someone who had experienced it. First of all, in my trial, we didn't call survivors as witnesses. For legal reasons, they would have been witnesses of fact as opposed to expert witnesses, and we didn't want to suggest to the judge that we needed witnesses of fact to prove the Holocaust happened. Our premise was the Holocaust is a given, it happened. We're here to prove that David Irving is a liar, as Deborah Lipstadt charged, and as he accuses her of falsely charging. So we called historians who used documents and who used testimonies of survivors. And we showed how you can answer deniers and show the history of the Holocaust with the documents, with the testimonies. It's not the same as the person speaking in the first person singular, but it can be done. The second point, I think, that illustrates this so clearly, illustrates the magnitude of the loss of the person who can speak in the first person, but also the sense that that doesn't mean that we lose the impact of what happened, is something that comes from my own life. I was telling a group of teachers yesterday that my mother came from a large family of 6 children, and her eldest sister was about 14 or 15 years older than she, and her eldest sister married very young and had her children very young. My mother married a little bit later. So I have first cousins who are 14, 15, 16 years, actually more than that, older than I am. They grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati, Ohio is a city not far from the Kentucky border. It's really a southern city. And when their father, who had come to the United States from Poland during the 20s, had come, and as many Jewish immigrants to the United States, and I don't doubt that it might be you might have similar stories here in Australia. He started out as a junk man. He had a little wagon that he pulled, and he would collect junk and then sell it. And then things got a little better, and he got a cart and a horse. And then things got a little better, he got a truck, and then they even got better, and he got a little piece of land and started what today would be called a metal reclamation center, but then we called it a junkyard, and he was a scrap yard. And he had a man who worked for him for many years, could no longer do the heavy work required. So my aunt and uncle set him up to live in the basement of their home, and he would do odd jobs around the house, shoveling the coal, shoveling neighbors' coal, etc., and that way earn his money. This man had been born a slave on a plantation. He remembered slavery. His parents had been slaves. He took my young cousins to visit friends of his in the neighborhood, particularly an older woman who was considerably older than he was, who remembered slave songs. She was very musical, and she taught my cousins slave songs. So for these 2 cousins, who are but 15 and 17 years older than I am, slavery is not something in American history that happened in the 19th century, but slavery is part of their growing up experience. So for them, it's something somewhat different than it is for me. But that doesn't mean that for me as an American, I don't see it as a blot on on my country's history, something of exceptional importance, something that has to be studied and understood. The immediacy of it is different, and I think that's what will happen with the Holocaust.
Thank you. Thinking about when I thought about how to introduce you, it did really occur to me that you certainly are what I called that rare combination, the historian who writes history, but you make history. And you made...
You have to have good enemies. I had a very good enemy.
You did indeed. So in making that history, in undertaking that trial, perhaps I thought you could speak a little bit more personally about what you learned and how it affected you personally and what it took to stand in that courtroom every day with someone who denied your integrity and insulted the memory of those who perished.
You have another hour? Let me try to just pull out some things. There was never a day where I decided, yes, I'm going to fight. It was just obvious to me from the beginning, especially once I learned the nature of British libel law, which I think is similar to Australian libel law, where the burden of proof is on the defendant and not, as in the United States, on the claimant, that if I didn't fight, he would win. And I just couldn't, I couldn't fathom that. There were many people, including some people from the British Jewish community, who said to me I should settle. There were historians who said to me, oh, Deborah, this is so silly, just ignore it. Of course, they had never been sued for libel. But there were people who said I should settle. And I remember one day my lawyer, my solicitor, Anthony Julius, who was a great hero and a friend to me, when he was told this, and I was standing there, he said, well, since Deborah's my client, what do you think I should advise her to settle for? 4 million Jews, 3 gas chambers. In other words, what he was saying, the absurdity of trying to settle. I give some of these British Jews who thought I should settle great credit, because during the trial, they called Anthony, they called me, and they said, we were wrong, you were right. This was even before the verdict. So it was just a matter of something I felt I had to do. It was frightening. Now I look back and, the great victory and the hero. There were moments that I was really afraid. I was afraid that the judge might come up with one of these yes, but verdicts. Yes, David Irving is lying, but Professor Lipstadt said spoke too strongly about him. Yes, this, but, and I was worried about that a lot. The fact that we got the verdict that we did is really a tremendous victory. But how it changed me, it didn't change me very much at all. And maybe this is analogous, and I don't compare myself to survivors at all. But I think I'm still the same person. I say outrageous things. I do outrageous things. I worry my friends because of that a lot. But basically, I think that I didn't gain a voice, but I gained a hearing. And on some level, people listen to me more because of what happened, and it makes me more careful about what I said. So I think in those ways, it changed me a lot. Or it gave me a tool that I didn't have. It didn't change me, but it gave me a tool that I didn't have before. But I feel, and maybe just to end this question with this statement, I really feel on some level very lucky, very blessed not to have been sued and the years it took out of my life, but to have been given the opportunity to stand up for the memory of those who died, for those who survived, and to stand up to an anti-Semite. I would guess that there are many people in this room who would hunger for the chance to stand up. And in my book on History on Trial, I end the book by talking about the fact that in the Shemona Esrei, in the silent meditation, we talk about the different acts of loving kindness that God does, and the whole category of acts of loving kindness, taking care of the sick, welcoming the stranger. But there's one act that is privileged above them all. It's when you take care of the dead. And that's called chesed shel emet, a genuine act of righteousness, because it says people who take care of the dead, who prepare the dead for burial, who accompany them to their burial place, who fill in the grave at the grave site, are emulating God. Because when you help someone else, if I visit the sick, I don't plan on being sick, but I know if I'm sick, they'll come visit me. They'll take care of me. If I help a neighbor, I know it's what you do in community. You help one another. But when you take care of the dead, there's no way they can repay that favor. And it's said in Jewish tradition that that's when a Jew comes closest to emulating God, when you take care of the dead, because they can never pay you back. And I really feel that I had the privilege to do chesed shel emet in a way that most other people don't get the chance. So while it may seem strange to talk about a legal battle that took so many years of my life, was so costly in so many ways, as a privilege, but I feel it was.
I'm going to have one last question, and then, yeah, I think that deserves it.
If you're thanking me, it's not chesed shel emet, so.
True. But on that note, I'm going to have the privilege of one last question, and then I am going to open up to the audience. And, those of us who are involved in Holocaust education, Holocaust history, we are often thinking about the tragedy of Jewish history and the tragedies of Jewish life. But when we think about the thriving Jewish life in North America, in Israel, in our own communities, I wonder if we could end on a bit more of an optimistic note and talk about what could the Jewish contribution to the 21st century be?
I'm a historian. I can't tell. Sociologists deal with the future. And generally, they're often wrong. Their saving grace is that nobody remembers what they had said, so they go on predicting. Historians deal with what already happened, so we're always right. We may be wrong about why it happened. So I don't know, Avril, if I can tell you what the contribution to the future is, but I think you're touching on a very important theme. And it really goes to me personally, and there are many people in this room who have watched me come back to Australia over the years that I've met in other places, with whom I've participated in Limud Oz and Limud, the mothership in the UK and in other places. And I think it's very important that Jewish life be a balance between the oi and the joy. And I didn't make that up, but it's a great line. I think that too often we're more comfortable mourning on a Yom HaShoah than we are celebrating at a Simchat Torah or some other Jewish celebration. And we should never let, whether it's in our Jewish schools or in our Jewish institutions, never let the message of Jewish life, and it was the same thing I was saying at the end about the need to study the Holocaust, even if to teach about the Holocaust, even if there had never been Holocaust denial. We should never let the message of Jewish life, you must be strong as a Jew because of the anti-Semite. It's the exact opposite. You must be strong as a Jew, dafka, afal pi, even though despite the anti-Semite, despite the best efforts of the world, in the history of many, in the remembrance and the memory of many people sitting in this room to destroy us, 1 out of every 3 Jews was murdered. Despite the best efforts of the world, look what we have created since then. Not just the Jewish state, but thriving Jewish institutions, and not just in North America, but here down under, in Europe, in so many places, and we thrive as Jews, we love life as Jews, we celebrate our Jewish identity, even as we commemorate what the world has done to us. And I think that's the balance we have to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I've been told we have roving microphones. So please just raise your hand and okay, I've got one right at the back. I think that is Rabbi Kamens. I can't see you very well, but I think it is. Okay.
Can I just start off without a microphone, I imagine? Can you hear me? Yeah. So what connection, Deborah, please, if any, is there between Holocaust denial or deniers and the promulgation of the theory that Jews or Zionists were behind 9/11?
That's a great question, and I think there's a direct line. There's a direct line, again, of and it goes right back to the deicide story, that the conniving Jew, the Jews who were warned not to be in the World Trade Center. There were lots of Jews who died in the World Trade Center, were killed in the World Trade Center. But these 9/11 mythers will argue that Jews weren't there, that Jews knew about it, that Jews made this up. It's the exact same thing. It's creating this humongous myth. This myth, which, if you think about it, is so illogical, but appeals to those who are the least bit inclined towards anti-Semitism. And I don't know if you can be least bit inclined. You either are, it's like pregnancy, you either are or you're not. You know, you're either an anti-Semite or you're not, you're either a racist or you're not. But I think there's a direct connection, and it's cut from the same cloth.
I'll take one from this side of the room. Yes, all the way down at the front. Yep. We'll wait for the... I'll try and give equal weight to different spaces.
Right and left.
Yes, that's right. I'll be bipartisan.
Professor, thank you for the speech. I want to ask you a question from near the end of your speech, which pricked my ears up. The issue of the post-Soviet bloc states and the equation of Stalinism, communism with Nazism. In Budapest, Hungary, you have this place called the House of Terror, which you probably know all about, which was used by both in the Nazi era and in the Stalinist era as a place to terrorise people. I remember going in there and watching it the two being equated and feeling quite queasy that they were equated, but not knowing how to argue against it. Is there a strategy going on about tearing this apart, that you can't equate the terms?
What you saw in Hungary has been replicated in Lithuania and in a number of other former Soviet bloc countries. And in fact, the thing that makes it really insidious is not just the equation of Nazism with communism, but who was at the heart of communism? The Jew. So it makes what the Nazis did to the Jew, it legitimizes what the Nazis did to the Jews. There is an intense effort in many places. I'm on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. I chair the museum's committee on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, and we are working very hard with these different governments and these institutions to try to fight this. It's a very tough battle. It's a very tough battle, and I worry a lot about what the long-range implications are. I wish I could give you a more joyful answer, but this is one that is joyful. You know, it's a very disturbing phenomenon. And you saw one of the ground zero, or one of the ground zeros in Hungary, where we see it most clearly.
Right up the back, Rabbi Freeman. I'm not favouring the rabbis, it just happened that way.
A likely story.
Thank you. Is this working? Thank you. Rabbi David Friedman, welcome back to Sydney, Professor. Lovely to see you again. Some time ago, a Jewish teacher in Western Sydney saw a child inscribing a swastika on a desk. And the teacher said, "You shouldn't do this. This is bad." And the student said, "What's your problem? Are you Jewish?" Seems to me that generations, maybe younger and older, see the Holocaust simply as a Jewish problem. How have you combated that in your experience over the years?
That's a very hard one. First of all, it's a tremendously disturbing phenomenon, because that child may not fully understand what they were doing, but it's sort of the unconscious anti-Semitism, unconscious racism, unconscious hatred, which has permeated their very being. And as you correctly put it, seeing the Holocaust, seeing World War II simply as a Jewish problem. I think the way I know to combat it is very unsexy, imaginative. It's simply by education. It's where I've chosen to put my energies, in the classroom. I don't know that it's a good answer or it's a sufficient answer, but it's the only thing I know. What it should do at the very least is say that we must redouble our efforts at educating about hatred, educating about prejudice, and educating about the Holocaust, and also not trivializing the Holocaust and saying, well, it's simply a matter of children should be nice to each other, but show the implications of the terror of this act. And that's why I think it is very important. That's why I was so glad this morning to speak to other communities, leaders of other communities which have been involved in genocide. I was in Rwanda last summer, and I was struck by the fact that there's denial of the Tutsi genocide. It's not limited to the Holocaust. I wish I had a good answer to give you. I don't. I think it just means we've got to keep on fighting. But I'm glad you raised the question, because it reminds us of how far there is yet to go.
Okay, I think I can take two more questions. So you've been waiting down the front, gentleman in the hat.
Hi, thanks. I had a question about anti-Israelism, and while the Holocaust deniers seem to be on the right, a lot of the protests in Australia around Max Brenner and the BDV movement, whatever it is, seem to come from the left. And I was wondering how people on the left hold progressive ideals such as anti-racism and that kind of thing, seem to slip over into anti-racism, anti-Israelism, and how you deal with that.
It's, again, another very important question. One of the changes that we've seen, I didn't mention this, but in the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism, much of which is not very new, is that it comes now from the left instead of the right. And what's distressing, particularly as someone who sees herself as politically leaning more center-left than center-right, is to see the degree to which people who pride themselves on fighting prejudice and pride themselves on fighting racism and pride themselves on fighting discrimination fall prey to the exact same kind of discrimination and prejudice that they claim to fight. People who get terribly upset and vigorously upset when there is some wrong in Israel, which may be a real wrong, but when it happens in another country, the soft prejudice of low expectations, well, what can you expect from Egypt? What can you expect from Saudi Arabia? What can you expect from this country or the other? Or who look the other way, you know, it's a terrible thing when Jewish children are killed, you know, in France, but sort of, well, if they only solved the problem in the Middle East, it wouldn't happen, instead of being outraged and saying this is the exact same discrimination against which they supposedly fight. It's a disturbing situation on so many grounds, and it's something that I think we won't see going away in the near future.
Okay, I had one more. I'd said yes to a question over here, but now I can't see the. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to give your two questions very fast, and then we will allow Professor Lipstadt to answer both of them. So John, and then I think it was the gentleman over here, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay.
How important are museums like the U.S. Holocaust Museum?
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it.
Given the fact that I only recently discovered that a museum like the Vienna Jewish Museum existed long before the war. So, yeah,
Actually, I should. Well, we get the other question.
Okay. Yes. Let's get the other question as well. Where were you? I keep losing you. Yes, you're behind. See, I can't see you. That's me. Okay.
You've had the dubious privilege of being face to face with one of these Holocaust deniers under intense circumstances, which many of us don't. So I have no sympathy for a David Irving or a David Tobin, but a question coming from a psychiatrist, you called him a liar, and obviously he is, but it takes more effort to tell a lie than to tell the truth. So my question has to do, has anybody attempted to understand the psychology of people like David Irving on the available evidence? I'm always reluctant to diagnose a living person who doesn't declare himself to be a patient, but we make lots of efforts to label people, including living politicians in Australia, and throw labels around rather recklessly. So I'm not asking for a reckless diagnosis, but there must be some underlying motive to explain why somebody goes to these ends to make these claims, and there must be something in their background which drives them. Has anyone attempted to understand this?
First, on the question of museums, I think museums are exceptionally important. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, which not only still has lines going around the block. I was present at the museum on the day about 3 years ago, I guess it is now, that a guard was shot. I knew the guard, you know, hello, how are you? I was in residence there. And I remember the museum was closed for one day while the police investigated, and the next day it opened its doors, and no one of those of us staff and those of us fellow researchers, scholars, and residents knew if people would come back. Would they be afraid? And I remember standing outside the museum at about 5 to 10. The museum opens at 10, and marveling at the line, which was longer than usual, and standing there weeping. Both because of the trauma, what had happened, but the people who said, we've been here before, but we came back to show our solidarity. But in general, that was a unique situation. But in general, I think museums are very important. They're educational institutions. And of course, the question is how the museums do education, how the teachers who bring the students or the individuals who come, what vehicles they are exposed to in that educational factor. But I think the importance of museums can't be underestimated. I'm sitting with a person who I should not be answering this question. You should, but the hour is late, so you'll tell me if I got it right later. But I think they are exceptionally important. On David Irving and what's in his background, I have three reactions. First of all, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm a consumer thereof, but not a. You should all be, you know. If you want to, if you're not crazy, you should. Anyway, that's for another conversation. So my expertise on doing a psychoanalytical analysis of Irving would be of no particular value, except that I know him, quote unquote, very well. But more importantly, I'm sort of reluctant to do it because when you say look for something in his childhood, something in his background, what you're sort of suggesting, I know you don't mean to do this, but the way it can be understood is that there must be some rational reason for him to be irrational. You know, when sometimes people ask, well, the person's an anti-Semite. Why are they an anti-Semite? Because their father was cheated by a Jew, or their brother was beaten up by a Jew. Now, if their brother had been beaten up by a blonde-haired person, they wouldn't be a hater of all blondes. In other words, anti-Semitism is I don't need to belabor this with you, but anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice. Prejudice prejudged. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. It's irrational. It's stupid. Prejudice is if it wasn't so harmful, it would be laughable. So I'm often reluctant to look for some key as to what made Adolf Eichmann an anti-Semite, what made Adolf Hitler an anti-Semite, what made David Irving an anti-Semite, because it would be trying to look for a rational reason to an irrational sentiment. Having said that, I don't know what leads him to this. I know he loves the attention it gives him. Which also makes it difficult when you're fighting him. But he loves the attention. He hates Jews. He hates multiculturalism. He loves the order that he imagines was Nazi Germany. He hates the Britain of the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, and yearns for a Britain of the 1930s when everybody knew their place. And he's a man consumed by hate. And I think that's why he's consumed by hate, I don't know. But I know that he's a man consumed by hate. And the vast majority, but not only, the vast majority of that hatred is directed towards Jews.
So I know we could keep going, but although Hilton seems mild-mannered, he's given me very strict instructions as to when I have to end the evening. And she has an 8 o'clock flight to Melbourne. She's still getting over the jet lag. So it's left to me to thank you for the work you have done, to thank you for the work that you continue to do, and to thank you for the generosity in sharing it with us tonight.